hello, folks. Anybody who knows me, well, I don't know if this is true, but I think most people who know me, personally, I'm saying, know that I am a front wallet carrying type of person. I stopped carrying a wallet in my back pocket years ago because it frankly hurt my back. I'm sitting down too much with my job. And one of the problems I have always had is trying to find a slim front pocket wallet. Sometimes I found some that are okay, but then they're made out of like some material that ends up fraying within like a month, and all of a sudden they look really ratty and nasty. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have found it. It's Ridge Wallet. They have completely transformed how I carry my essentials with its sleek, minimalist design. Check it out right there. I got like, I don't know, 6, 7 cards in there, you know, like I got membership cards, I got credit cards, I got license. Ridge uses high quality materials, ensuring it withstands daily wear and tear. It utilizes RFID blocking technology for added security against digital theft. It comes in over 50 colors and styles, so there's something for everybody. They've received 100,000 5-star reviews. It comes with a 99-day risk-free trial and a lifetime guarantee. This is really, it's really sharp, very sleek. And if you're tired of bulky wallets like I was, I highly recommend you give Ridge a try. I can also store a little bit of cash right in here. It's truly changed the way I carry my essentials. Go to ridge.com/majority. Use the code majority for 10% off. Thanks, Ridge, for sponsoring this episode and for my sleek front pocket wallet. I mean, you can wear it in the back too, but that's not what I do. Now time for the show.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
If I get the feeling you've been cheated.
It is Wednesday, November 13th, 2024. My name is Sam Seder. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Aaron Reichlin-Melnick, Senior Fellow at the American Immigration Council, on Donald Trump's deportation plans. Then, Daniel Hunter, activist and co-author of What If Trump Wins, an interactive Pick Your Path adventure on how we should, or how we can make it through the Trump years. Also on the program today, Donald Trump picks a Christian nationalist privatization lobby weekend Fox News host, Pete Hegseth, to be his Secretary of Defense. Meanwhile, Trump appoints Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. Can't believe didn't come up with that during the campaign, to sit on an assault government commission. And he appoints Mike Huckabee to ambassador of Israel, who has claimed that there is no occupation. Biden administration now trying to pretend that they never issued a deadline for Israel to comply with humanitarian orders. And the Trump transition team weighing purging of generals. Supreme Court declines to weigh in on a challenge to rent stabilization in New York. Dave Min holds Katie Porter's California House seat. There's 5 more races extant. Democrats are now at 2019 to 2011 deficit. Good news, that bill we talked to you about yesterday, House Resolution 9495, the so-called Stop Terror Financing Act, gets shot down. It needed 2/3 majority because it was brought up under a suspension of the rules. So good news there. Florida, meanwhile, pulls hundreds of books from its school libraries by such radical outliers as Toni Morrison, Judy Blume, and Kurt Vonnegut. And InfoWars is on the auction block today. If you are one of our billionaire fans, we'll take the YouTube channel and anything else for that matter. All this and more on today's Majority Report. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much for joining us. A lot of stuff to get to today. This is going to be par for the course. This is going to be par for the course in this era. Good time for you to go sign up for the AM Quickie, to be perfectly frank. It is free 3 days a week. Great way to get at least a bearing. We're entering into another era where there's just going to be constant stories that are just going to be disturbing. I mean, I don't know what else to say. The idea of the Biden administration just blowing through this humanitarian deadline for Israel feels quaint on some level. We will obviously talk about it. It's obviously a horror, but it doesn't get better from here. The ambassador to Israel that we are sending there does not recognize that there's even an occupation. The ambassador Israel is sending to this country was, at the very least, loosely affiliated with the Jewish Defense League, essentially terrorists. So, meanwhile, this story out, and I don't think this is a coincidence, frankly. The Wall Street Journal writes that the Trump transition team is considering a draft executive order that establishes a so-called warrior board of retired senior military personnel with the power to review 3- and 4-star officers and to recommend removals of any deemed unfit for leadership. It would fast-track the removal of generals and admirals found to be, quote, lacking in requisite leadership qualities. Of course, there's no definition for that. As Commander-in-Chief, Trump can fire any officer at will, but an outside board whose members he appoints could bypass the Pentagon's regular promotion system, signaling across the military that he intends to purge a number of generals and admirals. The idea, of course, is to make sure that he has Trump loyalists at the top. I mean, that's the theme here, folks.
Yeah, it's not because he's anti-war, for instance.
No. Here is the guy. He is appointed. He's going to nominate. We'll see if the Republicans end up okaying this guy, or if Trump does this appointment during a recess. But people in the military are freaking out. Now, look, I have mixed feelings about this because I'm not such a fan of the military. But this guy's completely unqualified to run, or I should say, he has no qualifications running anything.
Yeah, and your problem isn't that the military is too woke.
My problem is not that the military is too woke. My biggest fear about the military is that they become less professionalized in some way and more just a series of loyalists who, if they get the order to say, and we're going to be talking to Aaron about this, head into the cities and start deporting millions of people, or say, start firing on those people who are marching or protesting, these people are going to be installed to do that and make sure that that happens. Just a reminder, Pete Hegseth is the guy who said he didn't wash his hands for the past 10 years or something during his COVID coverage as a way of building his immunity. And here he is, just to give you a sense of like how serious of a guy this is. Here he is, weekend Fox News host. One of the things you do is you throw axes.
This is the right way to throw an axe.
No, it is all tied up.
And this was a Fox News exclusive. Fox and Friends co-host Pete Hegseth aiming for accuracy and missing.
Who's going to win this battle with the lumberjacks? That's coming up next.
What you didn't see on air is what the axe hit, or should we say who? Drum roll, please. West Point marching band drummer Jeff Prosperi got hammered by the axe while the other band members kept drumming. Ouch. But soon after...
Okay, we don't need to see any more of that. But that's the fun part of Pete Hegseth.
I hope that's not metaphorical.
It probably is. But here is the more relevant piece. One of the generals that Trump really wants to get rid of is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He is black. His name is C.Q. Brown Jr. During the Floyd protests, Brown spoke about the impact that the movement had on him and what it was like to rise through the military ranks as a black fighter pilot. Now, of course, the Hegseth and the Trump administration is never going to say, we want to get rid of the black people who are getting a little bit uppity in the military, and maybe have any type of sympathies to people who have been marginalized in this country in one way or another. So they'll just call it DEI. Here he is.
There's a chance to course correct it, but it would take the new Trump administration going after it really hard.
How would they correct it?
Well, first of all, you got to fire. You got to fire the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and you got to fire this. I mean, obviously, you're going to bring in a new Secretary of Defense, but any general that was involved, general, admiral, whatever that was involved in any of the DEI woke shit, it's got to go. Either you're in for war fighting, and that's it, and that's the only litmus test we care about. You got to get DEI and CRT out of military academies, so you're not training young officers to be baptized in this type of thinking. And then, whatever the standards, whatever the combat standards were, say, in, 1995, let's just make those the standards. And as far as recruiting, to hire the guy that, did Top Gun Maverick and create some real ads that motivate people to want to serve.
Again, this guy, I think he and his brother had a PAC that had $15,000 operation costs, and he is now going to be in charge of the largest budget of any entity, maybe in the world, certainly any type of public entity, $900 billion annual budget of the military. So there it is. We will obviously follow this. But the scary
Can you
part...
imagine if for just 1 year we put that amount of money towards like climate change?
Yeah, or anything really, for that matter. I mean, you would take care of homelessness for as long as anybody was alive. But the scary part about this is, from my perspective, is like, this is obviously just someone put in there with absolutely 100% nothing but total allegiance to Donald Trump, not to military tradition, not to chain of command, not to the constraints of of anything except for Donald Trump's will. And we shall see. I mean, yeah, people are saying the DOD will eat this idiot alive. That's very possible. And, you know, incompetence can go both ways, right? I mean, it can be something that ends up being played out because they're so loyal to Trump, they just do whatever in any given moments. But it's also a means that they can get rolled in a way. They don't understand the dynamics, but we will see. Important to know who these players are. We will also go back through Huckabee and that Mike Waltz. I mean, I understand how anti-war Donald Trump is. Mike Waltz, his, what is it? I guess the chief security advisor wanted to go back into Afghanistan, return, and wants to bomb Russia. So I know how much we were worried about this creating World War III. So I'm sure there's going to be, I have a whole long list of people who I'm sure are going to be screaming at the rooftops. Folks, we're getting into the holiday season. The war on Christmas starting soon. Some of you may actually engage in Christmas this year or in Hanukkah, which is very late.
Crypto Christmas enjoyer.
This is the one of the best gifts that you can give that also sort of like gives not only to the person that you're giving it to and not only to you, but then to like really your entire family. And it's something I've done started a long time ago, and I'm glad I did, all things considered. And that is Storyworth. I want to say thanks to Storyworth for sponsoring the Majority Report. Storyworth is offering $10 off your first purchase at storyworth.com/majority. What is Storyworth? Here's how it works. Very simple idea, but awesome. Each week, Storyworth emails your loved one, could be your parents, could be a grandparent, uncle, aunt, sister, brother. I mean, really anybody. A thought-provoking question that you get to help to pick. Things like, what's the bravest thing you've ever done? What's the farthest you've ever traveled? How did you used to get to school every day? Whatever it is. I mean, just, questions you wouldn't necessarily think of, but fairly simple ones. And Storyworth makes the writing process a breeze. Your loved one, all they have to do is respond to that email with a story. Doesn't matter its length. None of it matters. It just gives them an opportunity to do it. Some questions they'll be answered will be more interesting than others. And then what happens? You get emailed a copy of your loved one's response. This is as they're submitted over the course of a year. And after that year, which is fun because then you can sort of follow up on these. It gives you a conversation starter, as it were, every week. Storyworth compiles your loved one's stories and photos into a keepsake hardcover book that you're going to be able to share and revisit for generations to come. I mean, so this ends up being a gift for them, for you, for your kids, for your friends, for your aunts, your sisters, your siblings, whatever. There's really like multiple Christmases involved in this book. It literally is a gift that keeps on giving. I know as well as anybody that your folks aren't going to be around forever. And you don't know when you're going to sort of lose access to stories that maybe they haven't talked to you about, they never thought was important, whatever it is. Take the opportunity now to get those stories, both for yourself, for your kids, etc. Families love Storyworth. That's why it has more than 35,000 five-star reviews on Trustpilot, with millions of stories preserved since they were founded over 10 years ago. With Storyworth, I'm giving those I love the most thoughtful personal gift from the heart in preserving their memories and stories for years to come. Go to storyworth.com/majority. Save $10 on your first purchase. That's storyworth.com/majority. to save $10 on your first purchase. Also, this was huge on the night of the election, and we gave out a bunch for folks who came to the Bell House. Z-Biotics made it possible for me to get up the next morning. It works every time I do it. What is Z-Biotics? Well, it is a pre-alcohol probiotic drink. It's the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. And what it does is it allows me to bounce back the next day after I've had drinks the night before. I do not have the physical constitution to do that on my own. And Z-Biotics is a huge help. It was invented by PhD scientists to help you feel better the morning after. And here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in your gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. And Z-Biotics produces an enzyme which breaks this byproduct down. All you got to do, make Z-Biotics your first drink of the night, drink responsibly, and you're going to feel your best tomorrow. It allows me to do this show, allows me to do my exercises the next morning. Sometimes I miss those just in the course of things, but honestly, huge difference. And for years I'd been hearing about this, and it wondered what it was like. And it's I get why people are talking about it, because all you do, literally, you drink it. It's a little bottle like this. You drink it before you drink anything else, and you're set. So stay in the loop. Go to zbiotics.com/majority. Use the code majority at checkout. You can also sign up for a subscription using my code, so you can stay prepared no matter the time or occasion. Z-Biotics is backed with a 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/majority. Use the code majority, and you'll get 15% off at checkout. Thank you, Z-Biotics, for sponsoring this episode and making it easier for me to function the day after having a couple of drinks. I went to my softball, annual softball game dinner last night. Had a couple of glasses of wine. Feel great today. Well, I mean, I feel physically great. Everything spiritually is another story. All right, quick break. When we come back, Aaron Reichlin-Melnick, Senior Fellow at the American Immigration Council. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Emma Vigeland out today. Want to welcome to the program Aaron Reichlin-Melnick. He is a senior fellow at the American Immigration Council. And I should also say, I heard you years ago on Redirect, and have been waiting to have you on. Redirect, of course, the former show of our famous caller Ronald Reagan, who calls in. I mean, he's known as Stephen Robbins. But all right, so Aaron, let's get into this. I mean, one of the, I guess, most articulated policies that we've heard come out of the Trump transition team is the idea of deporting 10 or 11 million people. And with the appointment of Stephen Miller as a policy advisor, Kristi Noem at the DHS, Tom Homan as, I guess, the border czar. I'm not sure exactly. I know what that is. Maybe you can let us know what that is. But how real is this?
We might need to get him on the phone. I don't know.
Okay, we're having a problem with the audio. We got to take a quick break, and we'll be right back. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Had a little technical problems. I think we've fixed it. We have Aaron Reichlin-Melnick, senior fellow at the American Immigration Council, by phone. So, Aaron, I'll just repeat what I had asked you up front. One of the most articulated or radical policies that we've heard out of the Trump administration is the deportation of up to 11 million people. It is that policy sounds more real when you realize that Stephen Miller is now a chief policy advisor for Donald Trump, or will be in the Trump administration. Tom Homan, the border czar, and maybe you can explain to us what that is in the Trump administration. Kristi Noem will be the chief of the Department of Homeland Security. How real is this prospect of deporting 11 million people?
Well, to start with the idea of 11 million, it's extremely unrealistic that any presidential administration, no matter how harsh they wanted, could deport 11 million people in 4 years, because that number is just so high. We're talking nearly 4% of the entire U.S. population. And the logistics involved with any kind of operation to round up, arrest, detain, process, and remove 11 million people is so enormous that it's almost inconceivable. We're talking costs in the hundreds of billions of dollars to actually carry out. That is not to say that the administration that is coming in right now cannot significantly ramp up immigration enforcement and make it far more indiscriminate than it is today, all of which will likely bring up overall deportation numbers quite a lot. But 11 million is probably more along the lines of public relations than it is an actual plan for the next 4 years.
Okay, and we should say, just for context, there was an operation called Operation Wetback during the Eisenhower years. I think it was in 1950. I can't remember exactly, but supposedly it involved 1.3 million. But I think historians would argue that it was probably closer to a quarter of that of people who were deported, and that took huge resources over the course of an extended period of time. And I imagine also that was, a function of having a lot of vets coming back from the war. And but what are they going to do? I mean, how is this going to play out? If they're not going to do 11 million, what will they do?
Yeah, and in going back to Operation Wetback really quickly, this is the major operation which President Trump has been citing as his inspiration for the deportations that he promises in this term. But crucially, the majority of people who were caught up in that operation left on their own out of fear. And the actual number of deportations was far more limited. Not only that, many people immediately came back because the border was a lot more porous 70 years ago than it is today. So the actual impact, a lot of historians believe, of the operation was pretty minimal. Within a few years, the numbers of undocumented immigrants in the country were largely the same. So what is the key difference today? Well, today we have a massive expansion of the immigration enforcement system across the United States, not just at the U.S.-Mexico border. Surveillance systems built up, and the ability of ICE to find people through the use of private tools like Clearview AI, license plate reader data, Lexus data, and individualized personal data that makes it easier for the government to find people than at any point before in U.S. history. So there will be an increase in the populations targeted. They're going to go after the so-called easy cases first and round up anyone who's nearby using so-called collateral arrests. What that might look like, for example, is a team of ICE agents that get sent to a house, and rather than arresting just the one single target there, they force every person in the house to show their papers and arrest anybody who else is undocumented there. And we saw similar practices during the first Trump administration, and we expect these to be expanded significantly in the next one.
Who are, when they go to that house, I get the idea that they're just going to try and arrest everybody around this person. But how do they assess who that first person's going to be? I mean, my understanding is that during the Obama administration, which deported a tremendous amount of people, their first order of deportation was people with any type of criminal record. How does it work? How will it work under the Trump administration, and how did it work under the Biden administration?
Yeah, so when we look at the Trump administration's promises, the one thing they are now coalescing around is we are maybe not going to do mass raids. We're going to go after the criminals first. But the thing is, ICE has already been focusing on people with criminal convictions, and that was the key policy of President Obama in his second term, so-called felons, not families. And what we saw in the first term is they abandoned that concept of prioritization and said there are no priorities. Everyone is a priority. But what that means in practice is that you actually start ending up arresting more people without criminal records, because if you're not prioritizing only those with the most serious offenses, you start picking up people for garden variety immigration offenses, including people with no criminal record whatsoever. But as this question about how do they find those people, in the 20 years since 9/11, we have seen ICE integrated into nearly every federal law enforcement database. So ICE gets new targets when state, local, or federal law enforcement fingerprint somebody and it's run through the NCIC, the National Criminal Information Center, they have a couple of other databases that are constantly running and being queried by local law enforcement whenever somebody comes into custody. So it is fundamentally a target-based system. And I think this is really crucial for people to understand. ICE has never had a system to go out into the community and find people that are not already on their radar. And if the Trump administration wanted to round up all the undocumented immigrants, they would have to create a system to do that, which would look like indiscriminate enforcement and not the target-based kind of system that Tom Homan so far has promised. So we really have a tension in what the campaign has said. On the one hand, you have Stephen Miller promising to round up every, quote, illegal alien in the entire country, all 11 million. And then you have people like Tom Homan who have much more experience on the ground saying, no, these are just going to be targeted operations. And, which of those two wins that battle remains to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, how does, if Homan doesn't get the numbers that he wants, I mean, are there the numbers there that the administration and the campaign has promised? I mean, there is like I can't help but think if they haven't deported X number of people in the first 6 months, there's going to be pressure, right? I mean, somebody, it's going to be some senator, it's going to be some House member, maybe it's Stephen Miller, are going to be like, we need to do more. So is there enough people with Homan's pre-existing apparatus to satiate them, do you think?
I don't think so, because right now there are a number of very key bottlenecks in the system, and the biggest one is the immigration courts. There are 3.7 million cases pending in the immigration courts right now, 3.7 million. There are 735 judges total hearing those cases. There's about 5,000 cases per judge on average. And these delays take years. And the way our legal system works for immigration court is that if a person gets picked up for the first time, generally speaking, it is picked up in the interior in particular, not applying to migrants at the border, but people picked up in the interior generally have to go through immigration court. So anyone arrested on January 22nd, if they've never been deported before, may not see a judge for 6 months to a year, and they might not get a final hearing on their case until after Trump has left office again. And not to mention, we are still on a continuing resolution using fiscal year 2024 funding, and talk is that Congress isn't going to actually pass a fiscal 25 funding bill until 2025. It's not until March of 2025. So it might be 2 months into the administration before they even get the money to start the process of ramping up capacity. Now, yes, they can pull funds from other parts of DHS, but in order to ramp up the capacity we're talking billions of dollars, and it's not clear if they have that money without Congress. So there's a real possibility that we see a frustrated President Trump, a year from now saying, why aren't these numbers higher? And I think remind people that there were 5 separate secretaries of the Department of Homeland Security in Trump's first term in office, in part because he frequently got frustrated with people who would tell him things like, no, actually, we can't just flip a switch and turn migration off overnight.
So with all of that, I mean, is there any way for them to short circuit that process? In other words, can they say, I guess maybe there would be a statutory change, like that if there is reason to suspect that you're undocumented and you're in this country, then you don't get a trial.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, that is a real concern, because right now, everything that I've been saying presumes that there are not major changes to the law by Congress. I think if the filibuster holds, which is still an open question, it would be unlikely for major changes to get through Congress, but there is reconciliation. There are potential avenues for deals with Democrats, potentially some sort of harsher enforcement for Dreamers that could potentially change the way the system works. Then, however, you would still have issues with costs for detention, arrests, and some issues around actually removing people to countries that won't take them. But there's two other ways that the administration can beef up numbers. One is their plan for the so-called Alien Enemies Act, a wartime authority that it's last used during World War II for some internment of Japanese, Italian, and German non-citizens. And the Alien Enemies Act short-circuits the immigration court system. It's entirely separate, and essentially the U.S. government orders you to leave, and you have a reasonable period of time to get your affairs in order, then you have to go. So that's one option, though I think that faces significant challenges in court. The other is that there's actually hundreds of thousands of people in the country who have already been through the immigration court process and have already been ordered deported. There's 1.3 million in total. It's unclear how many of these are people the U.S. government knows where they are. Many are people who simply missed court years ago. But there are others who are checking in with ICE right now. They have stays of removal. They've been allowed to stay for the time being. And ICE is going to start revoking those immediately. And in this situation, they can tell people to come check in, arrest them at a check-in, and have them on a plane 48 hours later.
So we
saw this the first time around, and they're going to do it again the second time.
That's sort of the low-hanging fruit. That's when they were, I guess, hanging outside of courthouses. If a woman came in and reported a domestic abuse or something, the woman was subject to being deported. That type of thing.
Yeah, they will go after the easiest cases, which are people who really have no option for staying in the United States because they've got serious criminal records, which is not a large number of people. And the other option is going to be those people who've been ordered removed already because they don't have to be put through the court process again. And a lot of lawsuits in the first Trump term slowed that process down, but eventually, years in, produced some pretty negative precedent on the ability of the courts to stop the admin from doing that. So the courts will not be as helpful this time around, and they will be able to go after these easy cases first and ramp up those numbers.
Aaron, is there sometimes, and this is sort of like tangential, but is there sometimes a hesitation to bring these cases to the courts, particularly with the judicial environment we have now, because it does allow them to create precedents? Like it's as if, Trump's first term now has essentially greased all the wheels and eliminated all the points of friction that existed in the first term.
Yeah, so I got my start working in impact litigation for immigration. And, this is something that litigators think about all the time. Should you bring this case? And sometimes the answer is no. But when you have an administration like we're going to have, sometimes there is no other option. Even if you think you might produce bad precedent, just even bringing the lawsuit may buy time. And I think this is something we're going to see a lot in this next term. We're going to see people bringing cases. We're going to see in liberal district court judges in California or New York or Maryland halting some policies, liberal circuit courts in the Second Circuit or the Fourth Circuit or the Ninth Circuit, putting stays on these. And then it's going to go up to the Supreme Court a lot on emergency request, and we will see which ones they step in on and which ones they don't. But eventually, those will reach decisions. It's just maybe going to slow things down for a year or two. The other really crucial thing, though, to understand about this term is that in 2022, the Supreme Court issued a decision saying that federal judges, thanks to a 1996 law, cannot enter any broad injunctions against immigration enforcement policies. In fact, the only option to halt even blatantly unlawful enforcement policies is through filing something known as an Administrative Procedure Act lawsuit, which is much slower. And so this 96 law is going to put us in a place where getting the kind of court orders blocking Trump policies that we got last time around are not going to be as easy and will be a lot slower, even setting aside that the conservative judiciary, or the judiciary, is more conservative now.
I want to start going through, what people can do, both like on an individual level within their community, but also the other points of potential friction? And let's start from, like, I guess, further away and get closer to home. One of the areas of friction would be whether Mexico or any other Central American country, or let's say China in certain instances, or perhaps, African country, or whomever, wherever people are coming from, and that these countries refuse to take people back or take people who are not citizens of their country. That's one sort of way in which the deportations could slow. Yes?
Yeah, and it's an incredibly important one, and specifically because of Venezuela, a country which hasn't accepted U.S. deportations for years, with a minor exception for a few months earlier this year, where the Biden administration reached a deal with Maduro to lift some sanctions in exchange for them taking deportation flights, which halted as soon as they started messing around with the election there. So President Trump has said, he's going to do Operation Aurora and round up the Venezuelan Tren de Agua members and deport them all back to Venezuela. Well, the problem with that is Venezuela isn't going to take those flights. And we are already sanctioning Venezuela, and new sanctions are not going to change their minds on that. So unless the Trump administration actually lifts sanctions on Venezuela, they will find it very hard to deport anyone from Venezuela there, which as of now, there's over 600,000 Venezuelans who've crossed the border since in the last 4 years. And virtually none of them can be deported to Venezuela, just as for 50 years, Cubans couldn't be deported to Cuba. And this really emphasizes a point that the Trump people don't like talking about, which is that deportations are bilateral. They are diplomatic acts. They're not just an act of force by the United States on the undesirable. They are a choice by the receiving country as well to take that person back.
And so, there's a weird predicament where, if I wanted to put pressure on the Trump administration, say, I would be highly critical of them to roll back sanctions on Venezuela. If I wanted to inhibit their ability to deport people, of course, I also may not be in favor of sanctions on Venezuela. But that's the sort of like political dilemma that they face and that folks like I would face.
Yeah, and I think this is something that many countries around the world understand as a point of leverage for the United States, over the United States. If you are Venezuela, if you're Nicaragua, if you're Cambodia, China, or one of the several so-called recalcitrant countries, migration is one of the few things that you can control entirely outside of the United States. If the U.S. wants to deport your own citizens back to your country and you are at odds with the United States, it is one of the few things that is within your control as a sovereign nation to simply say no to. And that means that we've seen some countries around the world weaponize migration. In Russia, there is reports that the Putin regime has been sending migrants through to Norway in order to impose some strains there. We've seen similar things around the world. Nicaragua has been a main hub for migrants coming to the United States because they understand that this is something that they can attempt to use as diplomatic leverage. And Mexico, in particular, has more power over the United States than it maybe has ever had because of the blockade on migrants that it is currently undergoing and the agreements it's made with the Biden administration to take some people from countries other than Mexico. If President Trump comes into office and immediately adopts a hostile attitude towards Mexico, Mexico could just take its foot off the brakes and say to migrants, all right, we're not going to get in your way. And suddenly Trump would be dealing with a large-scale border crisis.
Right. Okay. So in the event, though, that they can't, the Trump administration can't negotiate and get, and this leverage is being used, then what happens? We could have massive camps, right? I know that like private prison, I've been hearing this for over a decade, that private prison corporations were saying at least 10 years ago, prior to Trump, that their future is in basically imprisoning immigrants as opposed to U.S. born citizens, I guess. Is that like, in the event that they cannot make those deals to deport these people on the other end, are we going to be looking at massive, like, essentially concentration camps?
Yeah, the next 4 years are going to be a bonanza for private prison companies and for contractors in general that deal with private prisons and transportation of people in detention. Geo Group stocks have skyrocketed, Core Civic stocks have skyrocketed, and we are seeing Geo Group say they want to potentially double their capacity right now. So yes, we're going to see a very significant increase in detention. But, on scale here, I think it's important for people to realize the Trump administration is going to weaponize fear here, and they're going to weaponize public relations around raids. I think we're going to see a lot of cases in the first 6 months or so where ICE carries out a pretty standard operation, the kind of things that they do all the time. And rather than a small press release coming out from the ICE Public Affairs Office, we're going to see the White House blast out media images of raids on these towns and in small communities and say, we've picked up 400 people, even if that's a pretty standard number for a large-scale, national operation. And the idea there is to send people into the shadows and get them to self-deport. You've seen Tom Homan already start doing this, saying, to the media that undocumented immigrants should just leave the country right now. And the entire right is going to lean on this. Fear, and more fear, with the hope that people go home on their own, because it might be too difficult for the government to actually do that in the next few years. But for detention camps, legally speaking, once somebody has been ordered deported, if they can't be deported because, for example, their country says no, the U.S. is only allowed to hold them for 6 months. But the U.S. can hold people indefinitely before an immigration court hearing. And we may see more and more people held in these camps, potentially tens of thousands of people at a time being held awaiting hearings, which is going to be a big deal, especially when they start rounding up families and throwing families into detention centers, which are going to reopen probably within the first 6 months.
To deal with that fear, or getting a little bit closer now, like what, and I imagine states could say, like, we're not going to have one of these detention centers here. I don't know that they would. But what
I think a lot will, actually. In blue states, there has been enormous local organizing to prevent state and local governments from hosting ICE. And in New York City, for example, when I was practicing as an immigration lawyer in New York City 10 years ago, there were 3 major detention centers within the area. They are all, or most of them are not operating anymore, thanks to local campaigns. So that's something that local advocates can do, is sort of push for blue states and blue local communities not to rent out their local jails to ICE, because ICE is going to need those beds.
What else can we do?
The other things that people can do is volunteer for local organizations. We're going to see a return to the need for accompaniment. This became a big deal the first time around when ICE would call people in for check-ins. If 40 people and an archbishop show up, maybe ICE changes their mind. This is the famous activist Robbie Rogbier in New York City, literally had bishops showing up to support him and come with him into his check-in, and city council people come to his check-in to support him, and it made a difference. The media was paying attention, and ICE balked. And though there was also litigation involved. So that is going to be helpful. I think it's also important for people not to spread fear on this. Try to verify information before things happen. There's going to be rumors being spread about ICE raids. Oftentimes, these aren't going to be true. It might just be a standard ICE arrest of one person, and sending around the message that ICE is doing a large-scale raid might cause people not to go to school or work or to pull their kids out, from daycare if they're worried about it. So verify your information, make sure things are actually happening, look for trusted sources, and support immigrants and immigrant rights organizations because we are all going to need it.
Lastly, temporary protected status and separately DACA. What are the chances? I mean, what would you tell someone if they're here on temporary protected status, like a lot of Haitian population, and I think Venezuelans are here on that TPS program, or DACA? What would you tell those people?
Yeah, this is a population I'm very worried about, and in some ways very vulnerable, not necessarily to deportation, but to losing their status, losing their jobs, and losing their protections. By the time Trump takes office, there will be at least 1.5 million people who have temporary protected status or DACA combined. Every one of those people is at risk of having their status expire or be terminated by the time Trump leaves office in his first term. When that is going to happen may vary between populations. Last time around, they waited for TPS to expire before terminating it, and they gave people with DACA one final renewal. So, we may not be looking at the expirations beginning until 2026 or 2027, but realistically speaking, that is a huge population, 1.5 million, that may all lose their work authorization and their protections against deportation, which is going to have profound impacts on them, their family members, and their communities. And we are going to be fighting as hard as we can in the court to stop that, but it is going to be a tough battle. One thing the Biden administration can do, I will say on this, is they need to be extending TPS designations now. They have 2 months left. People need to be calling the White House. People need to be calling DHS and telling them, there are 10 TPS designations that expire in Trump's first month, covering 650,000 people, 180,000 Salvadorans, over 350,000 Venezuelans, 50,000 Ukrainians, thousands of Afghanistans, 50-plus thousand Hondurans. All of those countries, their designations expire before July, by July of next year. So the Biden administration can go ahead and grant an additional extension right now, which will stave things off for at least another year, and they should be working urgently on this now.
Why wouldn't they do that? I mean,
that's a question for them, and something that we should be urging them to do. Yep. And if they say, "Well, we just don't have the time," tell them work late.
Who? If we want to urge, like how? Like if I were to tell, if you were to tell me right now, go urge. I mean, aside from the fact that I can do it on this show, but would I call the White House? Would I call my senator? I mean, what would you recommend I do?
I think, calling members of Congress and urging them to urge the White House and DHS to do this is good. Calling DHS as well. We've got at the American Immigration Council, the Immigrant Justice Campaign. We've got volunteer opportunities and ways for people to send messages to the White House on issues like this. So I encourage people to check that out. It's the Immigration Justice Campaign, also linked from our website. But yes, contact your member, contact the White House. Let them know that in the 2 months they have left, they better be doing something.
All right. We are going to put a link to the American Immigration Council. People can find resources there. And Aaron Reichlin-Melnick, I suspect we'll be talking again soon because this is going to be, I think, sort of one of the central elements of the many things that the Trump administration is going to bring that's going to make our stomachs turn. This is going to be one of the big ones. So really appreciate your taking the time today.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk to Daniel Hunter. He is an activist and co-author of What If Trump Wins? And Daniel has a piece out, 10 Ways to Be Prepared and Grounded If Trump Wins. This was obviously written before he won, but it is more than appropriate now.
Would have been nice to not have needed it, but
yes. Yeah, that's going to be a tough way to introduce Daniel. Like, I wish we we're not having this interview. But we'll be back with it in just a moment. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Emma is off today. I want to welcome to the program Daniel Hunter. He is an organizer and a movement coach and trainer, founder of Choose Democracy, author of What If Trump Wins, an interactive pick your path adventure, and also the piece 10 Ways to Be Prepared and Grounded Now That Trump Has Won. That was an update from What If He Wins. Daniel, I am happy to have you here, but wish we were not having this conversation.
I feel like that's the way I've been having lots of conversations with friends and gatherings and so forth these days, which is it's good to be with other people. And I wish the circumstances of which we were gathering were different.
Yep. All right, let's go through these 10 steps. Really, okay. I mean, very helpful. And, you know, I've been sort of winging it over the past couple of days, just largely from like, you know, my experience the first time around. But this is really, really helpful. And I also found it interesting. And, you know, for someone who is not necessarily immediately inclined to think this way, where in preparing yourself to help others, really, in this, you have to start with sort of like making sure, like it's psychological, what you need to do first before you start to actually get into any type of sort of like broader activism. And so for number one, it's you write, trust yourself. Tell us about that.
So I'm a strategist. My interest is how do we win? How do we actually beat back, you know, the policies that Trump wants to put in place? So I surprised myself because I thought, well, I wanted to write an article about how we organize that. And for a while I thought we'll start with strategic principles, but actually we have to back up a little bit, which is what is Trump? Trump is part of a global phenomena of right-wing populists. And they're not emerging from nowhere. They're emerging from a condition in which people are feeling greater and greater distrust of social institutions, greater distrust from each other. There's greater distrust. Just, I mean, if you remember what COVID did to a lot of us, distrust with our families and our friends. And as a person who works on climate, that's my heart. Even greater distrust in the weather. I mean, there's just, it's in the atmosphere. And so one of the things that authoritarians do so strongly is they add to that feeling of distrust, including just by our own selves. And I'm remembering the quote from 1984, that great book where, what did they say? The party told you to reject the evidence of your own eyes and ears. It was its final and most essential command. And so we have to just ground ourselves back in, you've got to trust yourself. The things you're seeing are there. You can't internalize the crazy making, or at least you can't do as much as you can to create boundaries around the crazy making that's out there. And so that became the starting point.
I had been reading, I come across some reading in terms of like just abusive personal relationships. And this is also like sort of one of the sort of like core principles within the context of that is like, how do you get past the gaslighting? Before you can do anything, you need to be confident that your assessment of what's going on is in fact what's going on.
That's right. And so I think there's two steps, which is one step is building some trust in ourselves. And the second is testing it out with people that we trust, extending that trust outwards into our community, which people have been doing naturally. I mean, reaching out to friends, texting. I've noticed I'm making like an own mental list of who are the people who check in with me. during this particular time, and noting that as that's a trust building measure. And so we've been gathering, and sometimes that's gathering around a fire pit, sometimes that's just hanging out. But it's also a chance to share assessments, not just about what happened, but about where do I want to be in these times? What are the pieces that I have to offer in what look like an uncertain environment? And so to use each other to help find grounding. So trust with ourselves, and then second, trust with each other, finding spaces to be together with other folks.
And this goes sort of dovetails into the third step, which you say is grieve. And I before we get into that too, I want to say, like, based upon the first two, like how do we assess whether we're overreacting? Right? Like, I mean, there is a tendency, I think, for some people to be like, I've got to get out of the country, et cetera. And frankly, for some people, I don't think that's, I think that's within the realm of, that's not unreasonable. I mean, if I was involved in, like, let's say, if I was on the prosecution team on the Manhattan DA's office, I might be concerned that they're coming for retribution. And I mean, I might, like, the idea of leaving the country might not necessarily be, extreme. How do we get a sense of calibrating what the threat is to us as individuals and what the threat is to different constituencies? I mean, we just spoke to an immigration lawyer, and there's like the idea of, deportation for a couple of million people is
on the table,
not in any way a overreaction to anything. And there are other cohorts of people out there. Well, how do you and tie this into the grieving too? Because that's also like a full assessment of like what the implications of this are.
Yeah. So, I mean, overreaction means that you're in reaction. You're in reaction to something else. And in this case, we're in reaction to a future that's uncertain. And so when you're in reaction to a future that's uncertain, you can't know if you're fully one way or another, right? There's no way to tell exactly what will Trump do, how extreme will it be. There's different scenarios about how that could go. So we have to check in, I think, a little bit with ourselves. And I think that's part of the community grounding, that's part of the grieving, which is to make our best assessment. And I work on climate change. And so one of the psychological dynamics that I'm familiar with is extreme thinking. So in climate change, we talk about denialism, which is the idea that in the face of uncertainty, it just isn't real. And so there's a set of people who just can't imagine climate change is real, and they deny it. There's another version of inability to handle uncertainty, which is doomism. It's just over, and there's nothing we can do about it. Both of those are, the therapists tell me that both of those are psychologically the same position, which is attempting to handle uncertainty by creating an absolutely certain worldview.
Right.
And so neither of those are necessarily accurate. Neither of those are backed up by sort of a scientific perspective, certainly not denialism, and not doomism either. And so what that means is there's a window of uncertainty that we have to be able to tolerate. Grieving is the process of assisting us to acknowledge the things we know to be true, grieve the things we think to be true, and allow some amount of uncertainty in terms of what might happen. And that may be very uncomfortable. Humans do not like living in uncertainty, especially when it can be things as deeply personal, as passionate as, what happens to my family, what happens to my own personal safety, et cetera, et cetera. But that is the human condition, and that's the condition we're in right now under a President Trump. That's not to say that we can't find some pieces. And I think the grieving process is about starting to name out, yes, he will attempt to do a mass deportation program of some sort. Yes, he will absolutely roll back climate policies at the federal level. Yes, and on like that, beginning to name, acknowledge, and let go of. And whatever feelings arise around that, anger, frustration, sadness, that we're in those conditions. But that grieving process is so important because even if you're not necessarily a feelings person, we all remember the number of people who ran around in 2016 in this daze saying, I can't believe he's doing this. I just can't believe it. And that's a signal that people didn't do grieving, that they didn't accept the reality that's coming towards them. Because Trump told us his plan, just like again, he told us his plan, and he intends to implement it. And it will be a more extreme version of, it's not the last 2016 experience, it's a more extreme version of that he's planning to do. So we have to accept it, believe it. Let's deal with the reality.
And so well, I guess the next part of that process is release that which you cannot change. So it's an acceptance of like, this is all real and this is going to suck. And we just don't know exactly how it's going to suck, and it's going to be dangerous for people. And we don't know exactly how it's going to be dangerous for people and for whom. And then the next part of that is saying, okay, starting to assess. And I am the type of person where it's like, I will prepare for the worst case scenario and I'll try and get that done first so that like I can relieve myself of some of that anxiety. Like I've done everything I can do. I may be overreacting, but it's easier to course correct if I'm overreacting than it is to course correct if I'm underreacting.
I feel like my pessimist friends have been in better psychological shape at this moment than folks who are holding on to greater amounts of optimism. I do want to just caution, though, I think one thing I just want to remind people about, because you said it's going to suck, and that's absolutely true. It's also the case that it won't only suck. And so just for folks who are in the position of sort of heading into a dreary landscape of it's just going to be, it will be chaotic, it will be rough, there will be bad policies after bad policies, 3 a.m. tweets that Trump comes up with a national policy that will twist the federal instruments into a new thing. All those things are true. There will also be many beautiful days that we will experience. And so part of the protection psychologically for us is to remind ourselves to be rooted not only in what Trump is up to and tracking that, but also in the beautiful lives that we have and the family and folks around us. So just to affirm, yes, it will suck. It won't only suck. And that's a reminder that I keep getting reminded to by colleagues of mine who are living under authoritarian regimes, who keep pointing out, yes, it's bad. Some parts of it are bad, but also there's a lot of beauty. And that's a little bit of the part of like releasing out. We're not trying to control everything. We don't have to get involved in every fight. We don't have to respond to every tweet. We don't have to track every wild conspiracy theory that Trump's going to put out there. That may be important for certain people. I mean, I think, Sam, you're phenomenally good at tracking all of these things and being, educating the rest of us about what's going on. But that for all of us, we don't necessarily have to invest ourselves in all of those. And in fact, that's going to be important because we just can't psychologically, I think most of us hang on to all of those things. And so therefore we have to let go. And so I use the Serenity Prayer coming from Randall Niebuhr as the example of that, because he wrote it while he was watching the rise of Nazism.
I did not realize that. I didn't know where that came from. My perspective on it has changed insofar as like, I've seen it on doilies and in knittings, and I'm like, oh boy. But it really, when you take that, grant me the God, I guess, but really you can grant yourself the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. When that is developed in the process of watching a fascist regime come to power as a result of that, it's really basically in many respects saying like, take stock, deploy your resources in such a way that you don't deplete yourself, and don't, and make a wise assessment as to what the landscape is and where you are best suited to, I guess, to deploy those resources, which is number 5, find your path.
Yeah. So then we're drifting into more strategy piece where I thought, we'll get right into it. But actually, it takes some time to get to that point. Picking our path is starting to identify what are the different pathways of resistance. So 8 months ago, we began doing scenario planning with different activists. I brought them in, and we did a kind of role-based, turn-based option. So Trump would do a move, and then people would do a counter move as unions and activists and so forth. And initially, when we began doing it, activists picked essentially two big strategies, which was, let's keep doing petitions. Let's get a lot of people to say this is outrageous in some way. And the second was, let's get a lot of people to show up at marches, rallies, protests, etc. And Trump didn't care about either of them. He just kept implementing policy. Trump would do this, we would do a march, and he'd say, okay. And then he'd keep going. And so we started to get more clear about, we need to help people understand certain roles will be more important. It's not to say there's not a role for marches, not to say it's not a role for outrage, but it's a different ballgame. We're not dealing with a man who values democratic spirit. We're dealing with someone who is a bully and authoritarian. And so a bully doesn't care about your feelings. A bully wants you to be in pain. So expressions of pain isn't the thing that's moving him. So that means we have to find out different roles. So I just sort of identified 4 that we started to see over and over again that were strategies for combating. So one of them is just protecting people. Huge amount of people are going to be lives disrupted, trans folks, immigrants, et cetera, et cetera. So the role of developing mutual aid conditions, developing mechanisms for us to protect people who are politically targeted. I hope some of these people who are targeted don't flee overseas, that they don't go overseas, and that we can, in fact, give them a lot of security support in our own communities. Second one is disrupting and disobeying. That's the one that I come from. That's the place that I have the most experience. And that's strategizing acts of non-cooperation. So in fact, the Fed chairman, Jerome Powell, is now in that category, as he just announced, will you resign if Trump asks you to resign? He said, no, I will disobey what I believe is a wrong order. And that's the behavior, actually, that will be very helpful for stopping an authoritarian.
We should also say that announcing that is also very important, right? Because it's the flip side of what we saw with Bezos and the endorsement for Kamala Harris.
That's right.
I don't think that endorsement would have meant anything. What it really signaled to me was like, oh, this, at the very least, this billionaire, I mean, this is the model, right, for how the fascism grows, where the billionaire goes, I can do what I've been doing, but I'm going to go with the path of least resistance. And I'm going to take that path before I even get to the turn in the road. Like, he didn't even have to threaten me. I'm going to do it in advance. And Powell sort of like, he could say, well, I'm not going to address this now and then have done, but by saying it out front, he's emboldening other people to take a similar position without it having to happen to him.
That's right. And that's a signal for the rest of us. So for those of us who are in government jobs, for example, to not resign, not make this easy for them to have a power vacuum, but to hold on and to use our professional ethics, remind ourselves, remind people of, we have codes of conduct, we have internal ethics processes that we want to uphold and stay despite the Trump administration's attempt. Okay, so we've got protecting people. I'm just going to name the 4 here. So protecting people, disrupting and disobeying, and then defending civic institutions. And so all the folks who are both bureaucrats who are inside will be involved in, hopefully, a defense for that institution, for the EPA to continue to do the thing that it does. And for the U.S. military, for example, who's been told, we've been forewarned, Trump has intentions of using the Insurrection Act to deploy military against protesters in the streets, me. And the military knows that will forever politicize them if they were to be using live bullets against protesters and doing lethal damage. And so that they understand Trump's putting them between a rock and a hard place, either disobeying orders or outright, or engaging in what will be the end of the military as we know it in this country. So defense. So every one of those civic institutions has its own strategy, and those of us on the outside also get to support them, partially by holding up a mirror to how resistance can look and encouraging them, celebrating the people like Jerome when he does that thing, yay Jerome, and celebrating people who get fired when they get fired for the right things, and so on. And so we have a role and responsibility in playing that.
You talk about this later in the piece, the idea of you sitting down, like I know you've done some like other sort of like, game theory sort of conferences with, military or ex-military people. And, you saying like it was weird for you to be sitting there because those aren't the type of people you tend to strategize with. And, I'm sitting here like the Hegseth is going in to clearly be part of a process of purging the military of people who they think is not going to be loyal to Donald Trump, as opposed to the institution or the Constitution, which, supposedly are aligned. And, me having to get over my sort of like, I don't know if I would call it prejudice because my disposition towards the military, I don't think it's unfair prejudice, but like I have a healthy skepticism about the military. But in this moment, like we're in like popular front mode for these type of things because it could be that serious. I mean, that's the tricky part is that there are going to be voices out there, and I obviously I conceive of this in my world, but there are going to be voices in my world, in my universe of like of YouTube and Twitter and whatnot, who are going to be like, "Oh, you're making common cause with the generals" or something like that, and it's going to trigger my like, I don't want to make common cause with the generals. I don't like the generals. I don't like the military, but in this instance, like, maintaining a focus on where the threat lies in this moment. Like, how do you do that? I mean, on some level, we saw it with like Harris getting together with Lynn Cheney or Liz Cheney. The problem I have with that is I just think it was going to be effective. I was like, if they're going to do that and it works, okay, for the time being, I can fight this other fight later. And I mean, I even remember a story, like an Israeli general was like told at one point, like, you realize your supposed allies in the United States, these Christian Zionists, they want you to burn in hellfire when the second coming goes. And he goes, I'll deal with that bridge when I get to it. And they have made that, alliance. I mean, that adopting that mindset seems to me to be a big, it's much easier for me to do it with EPA scientists. And it's much easier for me to do it with like some people in the DOJ, maybe depending on where they are, and in the National Labor Relations Board or et cetera, et cetera. But there are certain areas where I have a reflexive like, ooh, but you can't have that because it's about the civic institution and not almost like what fills it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two aspects of it. I mean, one, we don't have to play all roles. So I'm not a defend civic institution person by my nature. I have a different belief system, and it's not in defending the current version of democracy that the US has. But I am aware how destructive it will be if some of these institutions are fully taken out. In the case of the military, it's very practical, though. It's the second one for me, which is I don't want to get shot in the streets, and there are folks inside who also don't want to shoot me.
Right.
And so those are aligned in that aspect of it. And I think what that means is that what we're doing here is we're not building a sort of framework of common cause of we're all aligned in the movement together, but instead it's more understanding we have overlapping interests here about not getting the military to be involved in this particular set of behaviors. So I think both of those, can go hand in hand. And you're mentioning this is so important because it brings up the fourth category, which is alternative institution building, which is it's not enough. I mean, for those of us who are deeply unhappy with the current system as it exists, we're not interested in just defending the previous version of democracy that the U.S. has had. Instead, we're interested in new. Can we get rid of the Electoral College? Can we talk about developing participatory democracy mechanisms? Can we talk about strengthening education? Because you cannot have a meaningful democracy without education, representation, participation, and we barely have representation. So I think, the alternative institution building is a place for those of us who want to pour our energy into tracking all the many things that need to be changed and creating those institutions to do that. And so the reason I find those 4 roles so helpful is because we're not going to be attracted to all of them.
Right.
But it will be helpful for us to observe other people doing some of those roles that will be useful for us at some other moment. And I want to flag it.
And having some respect that they're doing it, like being able to say, like, this is not what I want to do. I don't like it. I'm allergic to this. But being able to accept, like, it needs to be done. And I'm glad that somebody's doing it.
It's all going to be hard work. Protecting the EPA is going to be hard work. Supporting people who are undocumented to find safe places is going to be hard work. It's going to be hard work all around. And so if we're not in appreciation mode, if we're just in criticism mode of that strategy isn't the way I think that everyone else should go, then we're going to spend a lot of energy attacking each other rather than appreciating the movement ecosystem and appreciating the different roles, including what I'm finding with some of my own friends is that roles that I used to play 4 years ago or 8 years ago, I'm feeling called to something new and appreciating that within their own selves, that maybe I didn't want to be a disrupt person, but actually this is now too extreme.
Number 6, you have do not obey in advance, do not self-censor. I mean, we sort of touched on that in terms of, like, Jerome Powell and the Fed. I mean, he is announcing beforehand that, like, if you do this thing, I'm not going to do it. And, in the context of this job, when I was doing Air America, we were all like, we're going to get audited probably. I mean, we didn't, which I frankly was surprised about. And I wouldn't be surprised if I get audited in this situation. Just because of the nature, one of the reasons why I got fired from MSNBC was because we went after Mike Cernovich and, he got Jack Posobiec to dig up an old tweet. They got Don Jr. to retweet it, and then it was off to the races. And, that specter of, like, do we keep our head down or something like that in the meantime? I mean.
Would you do it again, Sam?
Would I do that tweet? Oh, that tweet. Yeah, it was a funny tweet. I mean, that experience worked out quite well for me. I mean, at the end of the day, but
that's the story to tell, Sam. That's exactly it. That's exactly the point, which is it may be the case that you might lose your job at the EPA by doing a resistance something. And it may be the case that you will be so proud to be able to tell your kids and grandkids that you were part of a very important resistance campaign. And so that's the historical moment we're in, which is it's a great moment to take great pride in acts of resistance, tweaking, noses of the elites, whatever it is. And so in that way, it's almost a different relationship to repression than the relationship of I'm so worried about getting repressed. And absolutely, I believe people should make good calls. I think I have no judgment of anyone's individual circumstances. But what we're aware of is the primary way that authoritarians, we see this across the globe in Hungary and Brazil and Turkey, the primary way that authoritarians are able to claim control isn't through a lot of repression. It's through occasional repression that scares people so they know what to do in this administration. And therefore, they cede power right away. Power you don't use, you lose.
It's sort of the Fonzie theory where he told Richie, I'm talking about Happy Days. Nobody knows what I'm talking about because I'm so old. But
sorry, Sam, you gotta have to bring me in.
It's almost not worth it. I don't think there's anybody alive who knows what I'm talking about. But there was a show called Happy Days. It was very popular. Fonzie was the tough kid, and Richie wanted to know why it was that everybody listened to Fonzie. And he's like, I had somebody once That's all I had to do. And then everybody else knew not to mess with me at that point. But this is also a little bit more like, getting people to self-censor. And, that doesn't mean necessarily you're the EPA, you quit. It could mean you stay in there and you fight. And, people have got to make that decision. Reorient your political map was what we were talking about earlier in terms of you were doing some game theory essentially with people that you otherwise could just have easily been protesting in another circumstance. But it's about assessing the moment and understanding and prioritizing sort of like what's going to keep you from getting shot at, I guess, out on the streets.
Yeah, I mean, just to affirm my credentials here, my first arrest was against Fort Benning, Georgia, for its support for training people to assassinate human rights workers overseas. And so, yes, so the common, and I told the generals that I told these ex-generals my story, and they shared their story, and here we are in
that wasn't moment. The School of the Americas, was it? Or is
it was the School of Americas?
Okay, yeah. Okay.
So the reorientation of the political map, I think, has to do with when you have an authoritarian, it takes a while for people to catch several nodes. I think one of them is right now, a lot of us are really oriented around who voted for Trump and who didn't. And that's one way to analyze. It's not a very great way to analyze because, in fact, on lots of policies, on lots of issues, the way these things split is very different. And progressive policies are very popular. They remain very popular when you ask people, do you want clean water, clean air? Do you want to deal with climate change with renewable energy? Do you want to keep people who are here
expanded Social Security? I mean,
exactly right.
Healthcare, whatever. Yeah.
Name it. So they continue to be very, excuse me, they continue to be very positive. And so sticking to the framing around Trump, not Trump, won't necessarily be helpful in the long term. So at some point, we're going to have to break apart our political map a little bit. And it's not about did you vote for this man or not. It's more about, and therefore sort of the party element of it. And it's more about going back to the policies, going back to the ways these policies harm or don't harm real people. And so that's one aspect of it. And I think another aspect of it is under an authoritarian regime, there will be new, I mean, we use the word common cause and then said don't use it, but some version of common cause with people who we do find abhorrent. What do we do when Liz Cheney gets arrested? What's our relationship to showing up for her in this particular moment of watching him attempt to scare other people? And I think that's part of it is then dealing with the political repression.
That's honestly the perfect example to like really freeze me in my tracks, because just even at the words Liz Cheney gets arrested, I'm like, I felt a smile brewing inside me, but that's exactly what I have to fight against.
I hear you. Well, no, you can still, I think we should figure out how way to be both. I think we should be able to say, yeah, it's a shame she's getting arrested for the wrong reasons, or, whatever it is for us. But honestly, I think the truth is that we do have to do a kind of reorientation around people who are, particularly when we're seeing visibilized repression, even if those people aren't necessarily in our milieu, the political repression is not attempting to just freeze us. It's trying to freeze a population.
Right.
And so I'm jumping ahead here to number 9, but I'll walk into
it's like focusing on the act that is taking place rather than who is it's subject to.
That's right. And so the attitude we have in terms of when that happens. So one aspect of when political repression happens is we can share the story. That's horrible. Can you believe that they arrested Liz Cheney or Daniel Hunter or Sam or whoever? That's one way of telling that story. Another way of telling that story, I think I'm inspired by a group named Otpor in Serbia. So they were dealing with a dictatorship who was very repressive. They regularly beat up Otpor folks. And they used to have a saying that they would say, it only hurts when you're scared. And what they meant by that was they were attempting to create a story that says, we're not going to engage in fear. The major tool of an authoritarian is fear. And we're not going to feed that fear. In fact, quite the opposite. We're going to express and show bravery in the face of it. I did ask one of them, does it hurt less if you're scared? He said, no, it hurts the same amount no matter what. But the point here is attitude. That we're going to take a different attitude than being nervous, scared, joke about, oh, I don't want to get on a list. I want to get on a list. So one response politically, for example, I think I tell them the article is a story from someone I've learned a lot from, Bayard Rustin. He was dealing with Martin Luther King at a period of time when Martin Luther King was very young and new to nonviolence theory. He and a bunch of other folks in Montgomery were being threatened with arrest. So they went underground. A lot of the preachers were like hiding out in other people's houses. King himself had like left the city for a while. And Bayard Rustin walked around and said, this is not how we should be. He was trained by Gandhi and had a Gandhian philosophy. And he said, you shouldn't be hiding, worried about what's going to happen to you. Go the opposite direction, go towards it. And so he convinced a couple of people, pastors who were likely on this list of arrests, to go down to the police station with their congregation and to demand that they get arrested there and then. And so they went in, several of them got booked, and more people began to show up as the crowd like swelled, as people came out holding their citations proudly. And in fact, some leaders went into the room demanding that they get arrested, were turned away because they were told they weren't on the list. And they said, I'm a leader. What are you talking about? I should absolutely be arrested as well. And so they began arguing that they should get arrested, because what would their people think if they didn't get arrested? They weren't really a leader. So it became, instead of being a fear-inducing tactic, the arrests themselves became part of a signal of strength.
Well,
and that's what I'm talking about.
You're also in that moment taking power, because you get to dictate.
Absolutely.
You get to dictate at least one element of this. If you're going to arrest me, you're going to do it on my terms, and that's going to be right now, right here, that type of thing.
That's right. And you're doing it with your people. You're getting to say, signal. Again, this is attitude. This is about expressing an attitude towards repression, which is, rather than grinning, bearing, and being scared of it, that we. It's not always that we invite it. That's not at all what I'm suggesting here, but it's about the attitude that we take when it comes our way. And so I think we have a lot of control. And in fact, everybody has a lot of influence about what kinds of stories do we tell when so-and-so gets arrested out of the government or fired or whatnot. We should cheer. Congratulations. Welcome to the club.
Yeah. Let's talk about the Get Real About Power. This is really interesting. The upside down triangle. What does that tell us about power?
So the upside down triangle comes from folks in Thailand, were some of the first originators of it. And what they did was it's a theory of power. So you imagine an upside down triangle, and it's not stable. An unjust power is not actually a stable power. It needs pillars of support to keep it up. And those pillars may include a mainstream media that tells a positive story about them, or most recently from the last election, that treats them like, equivalents. There's this and that, and Trump said this and Harris said that, as if they're in equivalent worlds. There's military, there's any number of different institutions. But also that those things, all of those aren't done, they aren't implemented by the elites. People in power that we think of traditionally in power, they don't do anything. They tell other people to do things, and other people obey. When people don't obey, these systems start to fall apart very quickly. And that is the long arc around dealing with authoritarianism. So in other regimes, like when we're dealing with regime change in other parts of the globe, the pathway to resistance is developing a long story about why people should stop obeying an unjust authority. And if Trump turns out to be the person that many of us believe him to be, he is and will be an unjust authority in the authoritarian style. That kind of style doesn't respond to democratic norms. That style may or may not even respond to whether or not in the next election pushes him out. The reality is that we have someone in power who's attempted a coup. And so we have to get real about power. And that means convincing large swaths of the population to potentially not obey. I'll just give 3 examples of it. I'll give one clean example that tactically that's being talked about now, which is the idea of a general strike is a way to disable parts of the economy such that the whole system can't keep grinding forward. So that's one conversation that's happening around sort of in the non-cooperation circle of people. And I think I just want to say this, which is at this stage where we are, it can seem impossible to imagine Trump being kicked out because we're so far out of that period. So we're not there yet. Non-cooperation always starts small. It's always ineffective in the beginning because you're not at the size to be able to work. But very targeted non-cooperation has a history of success and has an ability to change national policy in a way that just pleading and asking for government officials isn't necessarily as successful. I tell a story from one of my mentors who recently passed away, Dick Taylor. He was involved in a thing called blockades, where they were trying to stop the U.S. who was supporting a dictator, Yahya Khan, of East Pakistan, what we now know as Bangladesh. Yahya Khan was involved in mass murders, huge amounts of people were dying, and the U.S. was the sole country basically arming him, sending armor shipments. So this group found out in Philadelphia, a group of Quakers, that the arm shipments were being loaded here in Philadelphia. And so they said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to stop them. We're going to organize the naval blockade. And they, with their 25, 30 people, jumped into boats and began blocking these massive arms shipments. As expected, they were pulled out by a Coast Guard, and they weren't successful on their first forays, but they began doing it over and over again. Eventually, they got to international longshoremen, and the longshoremen are the folks who load those arms shipments on and off. And the longshoremen said, if you guys set up a picket line, we won't cross it. They were moved by these stories of what was going on, and they realized they had a role to play in history. And so they refused to load these arm shipments. As a result, U.S. was no longer, first they stopped using Philadelphia ports, then New York City ports, then on and on until eventually they got the longshoremen all across the East Coast to stop loading arms shipments. That's non-cooperation. That's not a protest in the streets. That's not asking for it. That's not pleading for. It's saying there's a thing we're going to get in the way of, either as the Quakers who are jumping into the boats or as the longshoremen who are saying we're not going to load, we're not going to obey. And that was the major contributor towards shifting U.S. foreign policy in terms of supporting that particular dictator. So that's a history I want us to just be alert to, because it tells a story about how non-cooperation can be successful in this country. And that stratagem of understanding the pillars of support is about, if you pull enough pillars, it doesn't mean we have to convince the elites to go along with us. We're not going to convince Elon Musk. We're not going to convince Donald Trump. We're not going to convince the Trump family. But if we're able to pull pillars, they don't have a choice, because they don't do anything. They don't work. They don't do real things. They don't do things with their hands. People who do things with their hands, they can make decisions about how we actually do things. When we do it in united front, as we can collectively do non-cooperation. That's the pillars of power. That's the upside down triangle. When we pull those pillars away, the triangle falls.
And number 10 is envision a better, a positive future. And I think, we're going to spend time here, obviously, and talking to authors and people. A plan is better than no plan. And it's important for us, even in eras where we don't have the immediate ability to make, to shape society in the way that we want it to. It's important to have a sort of a northern light, I guess, and some ideas about what we would do if we were in power, both as an inspiration and you never know. Right. You never know. And that is a big deal. Well, this is Daniel, this is really, really helpful. And we're going to put a link to this and to your book, and we will check back in with you hopefully soon to get a sense of like where we're at and what's turning. One thing I just want to ask you about that is sort of off this list. I see things like, how we can create fissures within the constituency that has been supportive of Trump. I mean, you've talked about that a little bit, but I'm looking at like this Bobby Kennedy stuff, and I don't know if he actually wants to get into the administration or he's just trying to raise money or what the deal is. But a lot of the stuff that he proposes is completely antithetical to Trump's agenda. Like they want to get rid of the administrative state, and he supposedly wants to make the FDA, the EPA, the USDA more effective. He also wants everybody to get hepatitis or other diseases. But there are elements of what he wants to do that people are attracted to, people who are supportive of Trump, and they don't seem to realize that it's fundamentally at odds with the other part of Trump's agenda, which is to get rid of the administrative state. Corporations are not going to take yellow dye number 7 out of Captain Crunch by themselves. And so is there a concept of like strategically creating cleaves within their constituencies? Like, is that a strategy? Is there what are the tactics associated with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yes. I mean, the reality here is this is a riotous group of people who've been out of power for quite some time. They are not in alignment. They're not in agreement. And they're basically being held together by loyalty, an authoritarian loyalty system, which is perhaps more dangerous than being in alignment in some ways, because it allows them to move on a dime. Trump says, we'll do this. And they say, okay, that's the way we're heading. So that is in some ways, certain ways, potentially more dangerous. But it is true. They're not in agreement. They're not in alignment. And some of those things I think can be taken advantage of. I think the most effective way for us to do that is to really be rooted in our own values and asserting what's the vision that we have to become attractive. Because infighting can be handled and managed if we don't know if that's handleable, manageable. But Trump is very relaxed about a lot of chaos in his administration. That's what we've seen. So the idea that there's infighting, he likes. So I don't think it's an attempt to just kind of add drama to that, but I think it's about cleaving off parts of it and saying, for folks who either supported Trump or folks who didn't vote for whatever reason, I think there's opportunity here to say, here's a vision that you have that we're in alignment with, and to cleave in that way by being attractive, because the future that we're going to need is going to need a lot of people to have increased trust in us and our vision and in a sort of progressive worldview that is not well understood, actually, by a lot of the folks in sort of that group. So I'm less trying to get to the elites, and I'm more trying to cleave off the supporters, people who back Trump. But we'll find out that he has every intention to screw them. That's why he's putting billionaires in. He's not going to represent them and their interests. So they need a place to land. And so I think we need to create some open invitations, some places to do it.
Daniel Hunter, the book is What If Trump Wins? An interactive pick your path adventure, and 10 ways to be prepared and grounded now that Trump has won. We'll put a link to all of that, and hope to talk to you soon. Thank you so much.
You, Sam.
Really,
it's great to talk.
Really helpful.
Thanks.
Folks, well, we're going to head into the fun half.
The fun half hour.
The fun half hour. There you go. The fun. Yes, exactly. Not quite. Look, we're not great with math here. Well, I think, we'll talk about this, but I think we should clip Daniels and maybe rerun it soon, because sometimes I get lost. You got too long, and they were both very important relative to like sort of the immediate things that we're going to be facing. But we will both clip Daniel's interview either as a standalone or within the next 3 or 4 weeks, we'll just play it again as if it was, a quick repeat. Because I think it's really helpful to give people I found it incredibly helpful just to read it, to get a sense of like, okay, this is how we're going to approach this. And here's the value in doing it this way and that way. I think it's really good. All right. We're going to take a quick break, head into the fun half hour of today's show. Remember, it's your support that makes this show possible. You can become a member by going to jointhemajorityreport.com. Somebody in the Discord I just saw on IM, it just flew by me, asked if we were going to get onto Blue Sky. We're all, I think, more or less on Blue Sky, but we are working on ways in which to sort of like become more active there. There is and I haven't quite looked into it, but there is a thing that is like, we use Restream to go to broadcast to Twitch and to YouTube, and we're on TikTok, and there's something called Buffer that I'm going to check out. It's sort of like a tweet deck. Do you remember that? There was like these, but what it'll do is if you're on Twitter, you can tweet on that and tweet on Blue Sky. And, I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to use both going forward. Twitter has become less and less valuable to me as a source of good stories. That's my primary use of it. But it's rebounded as a resource in which I can create dissension. And that is, I don't remember if that was on Daniel's list, but
yeah, you didn't ask him about like tormenting Eric Weinstein and where that fits into the struggle.
Being a fly in the ointment is one of the things that I gravitate towards. And, there is an act of defiance, I guess. Maybe I don't know how real it is, but being on Twitter. And look, if I can make people feel like they've embarrassed themselves as to trying to promote Donald Trump as the peace candidate or the anti-war candidate or whatever it is by having all these imperialist neocons in his administration, I'm going to do that.
Yeah, stuff out there for the Dave Smiths.
Also, justcoffee.coop, fair trade coffee and hot chocolate. Use the coupon code majority, get 10% off. Bradley, what's happening on ESVN?
Yeah, so on ESPN on Monday, we recapped the Week 10 of NFL action, and we will be back tomorrow at 4 p.m. for ESPN OT, and we will give our picks for the week against the spread for Week 11 of NFL action. So check that out, youtube.com/ESPN show if you want to check out our clips or some past streams. But at any rate, we will be back tomorrow at 4 p.m.
Matt.
Last night on Left Reckoning, we had Jeff Shirky on, author of Blue Collar Empire, who's also been on this program to talk about that book. But we also talked about what we can expect on repression. We have all these unions coming out in support of, say, a ceasefire, and what does this portend for them? And also we got into the working class issue and what Biden actually did deliver and why it wasn't enough. Check that out, patreon.com/Left Reckoning.
See you in the fun half hour.
You are in for it.
All right, folks, 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half hour.
Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Anarchy. Alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you could imagine.
The alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just wanna degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back.
I take all of it in my throat.
Alpha males are back. back.
Snowflake says what?
The alpha males are back.
You are a madman!
And the alpha males are back.
Oh no, Sam Seder! What a fucking nightmare!
Bring back DJ.
Yeah, or a couple of them. Just put them in rotation.
DJ Danner.
Well, the problem with those is they're like 45 seconds long, so I don't know if they're enough of a break.
That's fucking nonsense. You see white people doing drugs that look worse than normal white people, and all white people look disgusting.
And the alpha males
psych. Fuck them. Snowflake says what? Snowflake says what?
A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. Okay, I'm making stupid money. Hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank.
All lives matter. Have you tried doing an impression on a college campus?
I think that there's no reason why reasonable people across the divide can't all agree with this. Psych.
And the alpha males are back. And the Africans are black African. And the alpha males are black. And the Africans are back.
When you see Donald Trump out there, doesn't a little part of you think that America deserves to be taken over by jihadists? Keep it at 100. Can't knock the hustle.
Come on. Fuck them.
Things I do for the bigger game plan.
By the way, it's my birthday. Happy birthday to me, Jew boy. I have a thought experiment for you.
And the alpha males are back. Africans are black. Alpha males are black. Africans are back.
Come on. Someone needs to pay the price for blasphemy around here.
I am a total pussy.
We're back. Sam Seder, Fun Half, Emma Vigeland off today. Matt Bradley here. Madman Sam. I want to make a prediction that RFK Jr. is going to find out at the same time as the rest of us that Trump is going to get rid of him in a tweet. I've decided RFK Jr. will not be a part of my administration, but we will still love you, Bobby Maha. I don't know. We'll see. Adam Ant Lefty. I've been quite baffled as to why there hasn't